The sun dipped low over the quiet countryside, casting long shadows across the yard where Jack stood, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn jeans. It had been years since he left the battlefield, years spent chasing a sense of peace that always seemed just out of reach. His boots scuffed against the cracked pavement of the driveway as he watched the battered truck pull up, its tires crunching on gravel. Inside the truck was Rex, a German shepherd whose name had once carried weight on Jack's lips. Rex wasn't just any dog. He was a war dog, trained to save lives, to sniff out danger, and to stand by Jack's side in the most harrowing moments of their deployment. Together, they had been unstoppable, a bond forged in the chaos of combat. But that was years ago. Today, Rex was a stranger. The shelter worker, a petite woman with a kind smile, hopped out of the driver's seat and walked around to the back of the truck. "He's been through a lot," she said, her voice careful, almost apologetic. She opened the truck's tailgate, revealing Rex in a crate, his ears drooping and his eyes scanning his new surroundings with unease. Jack took a step forward, his heart pounding. This wasn't how he had imagined their reunion. He thought Rex would recognize him instantly, that his tail would wag with the same enthusiasm Jack had seen so many times before. Instead, Rex stayed motionless, his body tense and his gaze wary. Jack swallowed hard. "Hey there, buddy," he said, his voice softer than usual. He crouched slightly, trying to meet Rex's eyes, but the dog didn't look at him. "It's me, Jack. Remember?" Rex didn't move. The worker cleared her throat. "Trauma can do that. He's been in and out of shelters since his retirement. Some dogs adjust better than others, but Rex," she trailed off, glancing at Jack. "He's had a rough time?" Jack nodded, his throat tight. He signed the final piece of paperwork and watched as the woman unlocked the crate. Rex stepped out slowly, his movements guarded. He sniffed the air, his tail low, his body language broadcasting distrust. Jack's mind flashed back to the days when Rex would charge fearlessly into danger, his trust in Jack absolute. Now it was as if that connection had been erased, like someone had wiped the slate clean. "You'll need patience," the worker added, her tone gentle but firm. "It's going to take time for him to feel safe again." Jack didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on Rex, who stood a few feet away, staring at the open field beyond the yard. "Thanks," Jack finally said, his voice gruff. "I'll take it from here." The truck pulled away, leaving Jack and Rex alone. The silence between them felt heavy, like the weight of the unspoken history they shared. Jack walked toward the porch, giving Rex space to follow if he wanted. The dog hesitated, sniffing the ground, before cautiously stepping forward. The house was simple, a small structure tucked away from the noise of the world. It had been Jack's sanctuary since he returned home, a place where he tried to rebuild his life. Now it felt like another challenge loomed, one that was somehow more daunting than anything he had faced in the military. Inside, Jack set down a bowl of water and some food, then sat on the couch, watching Rex from the corner of his eye. The dog sniffed the air, circling the room cautiously before lying down near the door. Jack leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "You saved my life, you know that," he muttered, more to himself than to Rex. His voice wavered slightly as the memories flooded back. The explosions, the chaos, the moments when Rex's instincts had been the difference between life and death. But Rex didn't react. He just stared at the door, his ears twitching at every small sound outside. Jack felt a pang of frustration, but it was quickly replaced by guilt. He couldn't blame Rex for the walls he had built. If Jack was honest with himself, he had his own. That night, Jack lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Rex had curled up in the far corner of the room, as far from Jack as possible, without leaving entirely. It wasn't the reunion Jack had dreamed of, but he knew it was a start. As the wind rattled the windows and the quiet of the countryside settled in, Jack made a silent promise. He wouldn't give up on Rex. Not after everything they'd been through. Outside, the stars shone brightly, indifferent to the struggles inside the small house. But for Jack, those struggles felt monumental. Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a piece of Jack's past, a living reminder of the sacrifices they had both made. And now, he was Jack's responsibility, one he wouldn't take lightly. Even if Rex didn't remember him now, Jack was determined to help him find his way back. The next morning, Jack woke to the sound of soft scratching at the door. For a moment, he thought Rex had decided to leave, to bolt for the open fields and escape this unfamiliar place. Jack sat up quickly, his heart pounding, only to find Rex still lying near the corner of the room, his ears twitching toward the faint sounds outside. Rex wasn't trying to leave, he was just listening. Jack exhaled, relieved but also disheartened by how far the dog kept himself, both physically and emotionally. It was like looking at a shadow of the Rex he once knew, the brave and unflinching partner who had trusted him with his life. Jack made coffee, the bitter aroma filling the small kitchen. He poured a cup and sat on the porch, letting the cool morning air wake him up. Rex stayed just inside the doorway, his body half hidden behind a frame, his wary eyes fixed on Jack. "You used to love mornings like this," Jack murmured, staring into his cup. "Back then you'd be bounding around, chasing anything that moved." His voice trailed off, the weight of the memories pressing on him. The Rex he knew hadn't just been a war dog. He had been a lifeline, a steadfast presence in the chaos of battle. Jack remembered the way Rex would sit by his side during quiet moments, the dog's steady breathing grounding him when the world seemed to spin out of control. But the war had left its scars on both of them. Jack carried his wounds in the form of nightmares and a limp that never quite healed. Rex's wounds, however, were harder to see, buried deep in his mind, hidden behind his distrustful gaze. Jack's thoughts drifted back to their final mission together, the one that had changed everything. It had been a chaotic night, the air filled with the roar of helicopters and the distant crackle of gunfire. Jack and Rex had been tasked with clearing a dangerous area, relying on each other as they always did. But something had gone wrong, a misstep, an ambush. Jack remembered the explosion vividly, the searing heat, and the way the world had gone silent for a moment before the pain set in. When he came to, Rex was there, standing guard over him, his body tense and ready to protect. That was the last clear memory Jack had before being airlifted out. By the time he recovered, Rex was gone, retired from service, and sent to a military program for war dogs. Jack had tried to keep track of him, but the system wasn't built for reunions. Rex had become just another file, another number in the endless bureaucracy. Now, years later, Jack had finally found him, but it felt like Rex was still a million miles away. Determined to bridge the gap, Jack decided to take things slow. He spent the morning working in the yard, fixing a broken fence and clearing debris from the last storm. Rex stayed close, but always at a distance, his movements careful and deliberate. Jack talked to him as he worked, keeping his tone light and casual, like they were just two old friends catching up. "You remember that time in Kandahar?" Jack said, wiping sweat from his brow. "We were out on patrol, and you sniffed out that trap before anyone else even noticed. Saved the whole unit that day." He glanced at Rex, who was lying in the shade of a tree, his ears perked but his expression unreadable. Jack sighed. "Yeah, you probably don't want to think about all that." As the sun climbed higher, Jack decided to test the waters. He grabbed an old rubber ball from the porch, one he'd picked up in town the day before, hoping it might trigger some memory for Rex. He tossed the ball lightly into the yard, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. Rex didn't move. "Come on, boy," Jack coaxed, his voice soft but encouraging. "It's just a ball. You used to love this game." For a moment, Rex's ears twitched, and his eyes followed the ball as it rolled to a stop. But then he looked away, his body tense again, as if even the simplest play was too much to bear. Jack's shoulders slumped. He picked up the ball and set it on the porch, deciding not to push. If Rex wasn't ready, he wasn't ready. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a fiery orange, Jack sat on the porch with his guitar, a habit he'd picked up during his recovery. He strummed a few chords, the music filling the air with a soft, soothing melody. To his surprise, Rex inched closer, his movements hesitant but deliberate. The dog sat at the edge of the porch, his ears flicking with each note. Jack didn't stop playing. He kept his movements smooth, his voice low as he hummed along to the tune. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small crack in the wall that separated them. As the stars appeared one by one, Jack felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know how long it would take, but he was willing to wait. Rex might not recognize him now, but Jack wasn't giving up. Not on the dog who had saved his life, and not on the bond they had shared. The night was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Rex finally lay down on the porch, still keeping his distance, but no longer retreating into the shadows. Jack watched him, his heart heavy, but determined. This wasn't the reunion he had imagined, but it was a start. And Jack was ready to face whatever came next, no matter how long it took. The following days were a blend of progress and setbacks. Jack continued his quiet routine, determined to be patient with Rex, yet frustrated by the distance the dog maintained. There were moments of hope, like when Rex would sit a little closer on the porch, or allow Jack to sit beside him without retreating into the shadows. But just as Jack began to think they were getting somewhere, Rex would retreat again, his distrust resurfacing like an invisible wall Jack couldn't see, but could feel all too clearly. One particular afternoon, Jack decided to take a different approach. He had always believed that Rex needed something familiar to spark the connection, a piece of their past. So, he carefully retrieved the old military vest and harness Rex had worn during their service. The fabric was worn, the patches faded, but it was still heavy with history. With careful hands, Jack placed the vest in front of Rex on the porch. The dog watched him, but made no move to approach it. Jack's heart sank. This was it, he thought. This should be the moment that everything clicked, the smell of the vest, the memories it carried, but instead it felt like a barrier. "Remember this?" Jack whispered, almost to himself, as he ran his fingers over the vest's rough edges. Rex didn't respond, not even a twitch of an ear. Determined, Jack placed the vest on the ground, sitting next to it, hoping the dog might finally show some interest. He spoke in a calm, familiar tone, though inside, doubt began to creep in. "You used to wear this every day. Remember the long nights in the field? The scent of the sand, the sound of the helicopters? We were a team, buddy. You and me, no one else." But Rex only shifted his gaze to the side, his posture tense. Jack exhaled sharply, frustration building within him. Was Rex so far gone? Would this dog, the one who had always been his shadow, ever recognize him again? Or had the trauma of war stripped them both of something they could never get back? Just as Jack was about to give up, the dog made a slight movement, his nose twitching, his body stiffening for just a moment. Jack's heart quickened. "Rex," he said softly. But the moment was fleeting. Rex's hesitation faded as quickly as it had appeared, and he turned his head, looking away. His gaze remained distant, as if Jack were just another stranger in a sea of unfamiliar faces. It was a blow, a punch to the gut. Jack thought he'd been prepared for this, but nothing could have prepared him for the weight of Rex's rejection. It stung deeply, a sharp, emotional ache that lingered long after the dog had moved away, retreating into the safety of the yard. That evening, Jack stood at the window, staring out into the darkness, his reflection a ghost against the glass. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. There was a chill in the air, the kind that signaled an approaching storm. Jack's mind was swirling with frustration and doubt, and just as he turned away from the window, he saw something in the corner of his eye, Rex, standing at the edge of the yard, staring into the distance. The dog's eyes were wide, fixed on something just beyond the trees. Jack stepped closer to the door, his curiosity piqued. What was Rex looking at? A deer? A rabbit? Or was there something more? He hesitated, but the urge to know was stronger than his fear. Carefully, Jack opened the door, stepping outside into the cool night air. Rex didn't flinch, didn't look back at Jack as the veteran approached. "Rex," Jack called softly, but the dog didn't move. His gaze was locked onto something in the distance, something hidden by the trees. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a tension that Jack couldn't quite place. Jack's hand hovered over Rex's shoulder, unsure whether to approach or stay back. The dog hadn't reacted to his voice, hadn't shown any recognition at all. It was as if he were lost in a trance, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance that Jack couldn't see. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled from Rex's chest, deep and menacing. Jack froze, his pulse quickening. The sound was unlike anything he had heard before. It wasn't the playful growl of a dog anticipating a game. It was something darker, more primal, as if Rex were warning him away from something dangerous. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. He didn't want to break the fragile moment, but the unease in his chest was growing, tightening like a vice. The growl grew louder, more intense, and for the first time since Rex had arrived, Jack felt a flicker of fear. He had never seen the dog like this before, unpredictable, on edge, and aggressive. Rex's body was tense, his tail stiff behind him. Jack took a cautious step back, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. Then, without warning, Rex bolted. The sudden movement startled Jack, and he instinctively reached out to call him back. "Rex, wait!" But the dog was already disappearing into the darkness, running toward the trees. Jack's breath hitched as he followed, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Rex's usual agility and precision were gone, replaced by an uncontrolled urgency. Jack had never seen the dog act like this before, and the fear that had been simmering inside him bloomed into full-blown terror. "Rex!" Jack shouted again, but there was no response. The yard was now eerily silent. The storm in the distance was closer, the thunder rumbling low in the sky, but Jack couldn't focus on that now. He had to find Rex. His mind raced, his heart thumping in his chest as he sprinted after the dog. What had caused this sudden shift? Why was Rex acting so strangely? As Jack neared the edge of the trees, he saw Rex again, standing at the base of an old oak, his eyes wild and unseeing. Jack stopped in his tracks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't the dog he knew. Something was wrong. Something deep and primal had taken hold of Rex, and Jack feared that whatever it was, it might not let go. But what was it? And could Jack get his partner back before it was too late? The tension between Jack and Rex reached a boiling point in the days that followed the strange incident in the woods. Every time Jack approached the dog, Rex seemed to retreat further, his distrust growing like a shadow Jack couldn't shake. It was as though the dog's mind was fractured, caught between fragments of the past and a painful present that neither of them could escape. Jack's attempts to connect were growing more desperate. He tried everything he could think of, familiar toys, old scents, even the sound of his voice, but Rex was distant, unresponsive, and often aggressive. The quiet moments where Jack had hoped for a spark of recognition were growing fewer and fewer. But then came the night that truly shook Jack to his core. It started like any other evening. The wind was picking up outside, the storm from the previous night still lingering in the distance. Jack was sitting on the couch, a half-empty cup of coffee in his hands, staring out the window. The house felt empty, too quiet, and the stillness made the tension in his chest grow tighter with each passing minute. He glanced at the hallway where Rex had made a habit of lying down in the last few days. But tonight, there was no dog. "Rex," Jack called softly, though he already had a feeling that something was off. He stood up, walking toward the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. He paused at the door to the back room, the one where he had set up Rex's bed and food bowl. It was always the first place he checked if he couldn't find the dog. But as Jack reached the door, he stopped dead in his tracks. Rex wasn't lying down or sitting by the door or anywhere near his bed. Instead, the dog was standing in the far corner of the room, his back to Jack, his body unnaturally still. The room felt colder now, as if a heavy presence had settled in, something that wasn't there before. Jack hesitated. Something about the way Rex stood was wrong. The dog was rigid, unmoving, and his eyes. Jack had never seen them like this before. They were wide, unblinking, locked onto something invisible, as if he were staring into the depths of the night itself. Rex. Jack's voice trembled, and as if on cue, the dog's head jerked sharply toward him. The reaction was instantaneous, but not the one Jack had expected. Rex's eyes were wild, pupils dilated, and his body shook with a barely contained energy. Jack took a cautious step forward, holding his breath, trying not to startle the dog any further. But Rex's growl came low and guttural, so unlike anything Jack had ever heard. "Rex, buddy, it's okay," Jack murmured, his voice shaky, but filled with the urgency of wanting to calm the dog. "It's just me, Jack. You remember me, right?" But instead of coming toward him, Rex took a step back, a low snarl rising from his chest. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The growl wasn't just out of fear, it was warning, a clear signal that Rex saw him not as his former partner, but as something dangerous. Jack reached out, but the movement sent Rex into a frenzy. The dog backed away, his body tense with anxiety, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, and Jack could feel his own fear tightening around him. "Rex, please," Jack's voice cracked, but it didn't reach the dog. Rex was too far gone, lost in his own confusion and terror. Jack had never seen Rex like this before. It was as if the dog didn't even recognize him anymore. In a flash, Rex lunged. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he jumped back just in time, narrowly avoiding the dog's teeth. His breath caught in his throat as he scrambled to gain control of the situation. But Rex wasn't stopping. He was unpredictable, charging at Jack with renewed fury. For the first time in their years together, the veteran was afraid. This wasn't the dog he had known. This wasn't the loyal companion who had fought by his side, the dog who had saved his life more times than he could count. This was a broken animal, lost and angry, consumed by something Jack couldn't understand. The door to the back room slammed open as Jack backed into it, and Rex's frantic barking echoed through the house. Jack's heart raced as he tried to call the dog back, but Rex wasn't responding. Desperation clawed at Jack. He didn't know what had happened, but something was off, something deeper than just the trauma of war. There was a part of Rex that was unreachable, and Jack had no idea how to bring him back. Then, as suddenly as it had started, Rex froze. His body tensed, his tail low, and he looked toward the window. Jack, still trying to catch his breath, turned in the direction Rex was staring. But there was nothing there, nothing visible at least. Rex's stance changed. The aggressive energy seemed to drain from him, and he sank to the floor, his eyes darting around as if seeing shadows in the corners of the room. "Rex," Jack whispered cautiously, his heart still pounding in his chest. But the dog didn't move. Jack couldn't take his eyes off him, torn between the need to understand what was happening and the overwhelming fear of what Rex might do next. The house felt darker now, colder. Jack's mind raced, thoughts jumbled and frantic. Was this the result of trauma, or was something more sinister at play? As he stared at Rex, Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The dog had always been the protector, the fighter, the one who would never let Jack down. But now he wasn't sure who he was looking at anymore. Was this the same loyal partner he'd fought beside, or had the war taken even more than he realized? And if he didn't know who Rex was anymore, how could he possibly help him? The stakes had never felt higher. Jack stood motionless, his breath shallow as he watched Rex, the dog he had once trusted with his life, crumple in front of him, uncertain and lost. The room was suffocating in its silence, the only sound being the ragged panting of Rex, whose body still trembled with whatever unseen force gripped him. Jack knew this wasn't just fear. This was something deeper, something that cut through the dog's very essence. Jack's chest tightened, a mixture of frustration, confusion, and a sinking feeling in his gut. He had seen Rex face death head-on, stare down danger, without flinching. But now, the dog he had once called his partner was a broken, snarling shadow. Jack reached out, his hand shaking. "It's me, Rex." "It's Jack," he whispered again, hoping the familiarity of his voice would break through whatever hold had seized the dog's mind. Rex's eyes flickered toward him, but there was no recognition, no spark of the bond they once shared. Jack's heart clenched. This wasn't just the result of war or of trauma. It was something far more unsettling. Something was wrong in a way Jack couldn't understand. Rex lifted his head slowly, his gaze shifting to the window once more, as if some unseen force outside was calling him. The dog's body went rigid again, every muscle coiled in a way that told Jack the battle inside Rex wasn't over. But then the unthinkable happened. Without warning, Rex suddenly darted toward the door with a speed that caught Jack off guard. His heart raced as he sprang after him, the weight of panic and the growing realization that something was slipping through his fingers, urging him forward. "Rex, no!" Jack shouted, his voice desperate, but Rex didn't stop. The dog bolted out of the house, heading toward the woods behind Jack's property, faster than Jack could follow. It was as if a primal instinct had taken over the dog, and nothing would stop him. Jack had been in enough dangerous situations to know when he was chasing a ghost. This was more than just a wayward animal. It was a reflection of the war that had fractured both of them. Rex had been trained for this, to follow orders without question. But now Jack couldn't command him. He couldn't control the situation. It felt like every step forward only sent Rex further away. With his heart pounding, Jack grabbed his jacket and sprinted after him. The storm that had been lingering on the horizon had finally arrived, the heavy rain pelting down as thunder rumbled overhead. It was a chase Jack didn't fully understand, but he couldn't stop running. The trees around him blurred in a chaotic rush as he pushed through the wet underbrush, his eyes never leaving Rex, who seemed to be guided by something more than instinct now. Jack's breath caught as he noticed the dog veering toward the same clearing he and Rex had often trained in during their time together in the military. Once a place of safety and trust, now it seemed to hold a dark power over the dog. Jack's throat tightened as he caught up, stopping at the edge of the clearing. Rex had stopped in the middle of it, standing motionless, his gaze fixed on the dark forest beyond. The dog's ears flicked back, his whole body tense, with something Jack couldn't name. Jack approached slowly, his voice soft but firm. "Rex, buddy, please, just come back." Rex's body quivered. He took a single step forward, then stopped again. His gaze never shifted from the trees, the growl that had been simmering inside him beginning to grow once more. Something was drawing him in, something that Jack couldn't see, couldn't understand. Then, as though a switch had flipped, Rex let out a low, primal howl that sent a chill running down Jack's spine. It was a cry of desperation and pain, the sound echoing through the trees, cutting through the night air. Jack's heart dropped. He knew that howl. It was a call to something far beyond the physical world. Something from the past, from the dark corners of the war that Rex had fought. The trauma, the fear, the scars that had never fully healed. Jack realized that the dog wasn't just trying to escape. He was being pulled toward something he couldn't outrun. With every step Jack took toward Rex, the dog seemed to retreat further into the clearing. Jack felt the pull of panic rising in his chest, but he couldn't let Rex slip away. Not now. Not like this. Not after everything they had been through together. Rex stopped at the edge of the trees, his eyes wide, and his body trembling violently. And in that moment, Jack saw it. The recognition he had been hoping for. It wasn't complete, but it was there. A flicker of memory, a whisper of their past partnership. The storm raged on, but Jack stood still in the rain, facing Rex. The winds howled and the thunder crashed, but all Jack could hear was the deafening silence between them. "Please, Rex," Jack whispered, holding out his hand. He didn't know what was happening or how to fix it, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't giving up on his partner. No matter what. The storm had reached its peak. The rain pelted down in sheets, the wind howled through the trees, and the air was thick with tension. Jack stood in the clearing, heart racing as he watched Rex, the dog who had once been his closest companion, tremble at the edge of the woods. The familiar bond that had once existed between them felt like a distant memory now. Jack's voice trembled as he called out, "Rex, please, come back to me." Rex was no longer the dog he had known. The fierce loyalty that had once been unwavering was now replaced by a deep, primal fear. Jack could see the confusion in his eyes, the struggle that seemed to tear at him from within. Rex's body was tense, his muscles coiled as though preparing for something he couldn't name, something Jack couldn't understand. For a long moment, there was only the storm, the wind, and the sound of their breathing. Jack's mind raced. What had happened to his dog? What had changed between them? Was it the trauma of war that had broken their bond? Or was something else at play here? A flash of lightning illuminated the clearing, and in that instant, Jack saw something that made his blood run cold. Rex's gaze shifted away from the trees, locking onto Jack with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The dog's posture shifted, his muscles taut with a mix of aggression and confusion. For a heartbeat, Jack saw it. Something in Rex's eyes that made him question everything he thought he knew about the dog. The hesitation was gone. The loyalty he had once felt from Rex seemed to vanish, replaced by something darker. Something wild. Something that was no longer the dog he had trusted with his life. Rex suddenly lunged forward, his growl low and guttural, the sound carrying through the trees like a warning. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he took a step back, his instincts kicking in. The dog wasn't just confused anymore, he was attacking. The bond between them had fractured beyond repair, and Jack was now the enemy. "Rex!" Jack shouted, but the dog's eyes were glazed over, consumed by something deeper than instinct. The ground beneath Jack's feet felt slippery with rain, and he stumbled as Rex charged at him. He barely had time to react before the dog was upon him, knocking him to the wet earth. Jack's breath was knocked out of him, his hands instinctively trying to push the dog away, but Rex was too strong, too determined. His teeth bared, a snarl of fury escaping from his throat. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears as he struggled to push Rex off. But there was no sign of recognition, no sign of the dog he had once known. All he saw was an animal, a creature driven by a fear so deep it had overridden every ounce of training, every memory they had shared. In the chaos, Jack's mind raced. What had happened to Rex? Why had he snapped like this? The military whistle, the ball, the training sessions they had shared, none of it had mattered. Rex was no longer his partner. The dog that had once saved his life was now a stranger, and Jack was terrified of what might happen next. Rex's jaws snapped dangerously close to Jack's face, and for a moment, Jack thought he might be torn apart. But then, in the midst of the violence, something shifted. A flash of recognition, just a glimpse, shone through Rex's wild eyes. For the briefest second, Jack saw the dog he had once known, the dog that had fought beside him, the dog that had trusted him without question. It was gone as quickly as it had come, but Jack held onto it like a lifeline. He didn't know how or why, but he knew that Rex wasn't lost completely. There was still a part of the old dog inside, buried beneath the layers of fear and trauma. "Rex, it's me," Jack gasped, his voice hoarse, as he struggled to break free from the dog's grip. "Please, you're not alone. I'm not going to hurt you." Rex hesitated, his body still poised for attack. Jack's heart raced in his chest as he fought to stay calm, his fingers trembling as he reached out, not sure what would happen if he made the wrong move. He knew the dog was scared. He had seen it before during their time in the military. But this was different. This wasn't just fear, it was terror. Deep, raw terror. Another flash of lightning illuminated the sky, casting long shadows over the clearing. In that instant, Rex froze, his body stiffening. Jack could see it. The same hesitation, the same uncertainty he had seen in Rex's eyes when they had first reunited. There was something blocking him. Something in the dog's mind that was keeping him from recognizing the one person who had never given up on him. Jack's pulse thudded in his ears as he slowly, carefully reached out again. "Rex, come on, buddy. It's me." He saw it again, a flicker of recognition. But this time it was different. The fear in Rex's eyes didn't seem as deep, and his body seemed less tense, less aggressive. The battle inside the dog was far from over. But for the first time since he had arrived at Jack's house, there was a crack in the wall that had separated them. Jack felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered with fear. This wasn't over. It would never be easy. The storm still raged around them, but Jack had to believe that Rex could come back, that their bond could be restored. "Please, Rex," Jack whispered, his voice raw, with emotion. "Don't leave me." As the storm howled around them, Jack held his breath, waiting for the moment when everything would change, or when it would all fall apart. The rain fell harder, the wind howling like an animal in the distance, but inside the storm, a quiet moment hung in the air between Jack and Rex. They stood face to face, neither moving, neither trusting the other fully yet. Rex's heavy breathing was the only sound besides the distant crack of thunder. Jack's heart thundered in his chest, matching the rhythm of the storm. He slowly lowered his hand, feeling the weight of every second that ticked by in silence. This wasn't just a test of patience. It was a test of everything he'd ever known about loyalty, love, and fear. Could he bring his dog back from the brink? Could they both find their way out of this storm of trauma? Then it happened. Rex, still trembling, took a tentative step forward. His ears were pinned back, his eyes wide with uncertainty. But there was something else in them now. A spark. A flicker of recognition that Jack had been praying for. Slowly, painfully, Jack knelt down, making himself smaller, less threatening. He needed Rex to understand. "It's okay, boy. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'll never hurt you. You're safe now." His voice was soft, but firm, the words a plea more than anything else. Rex stopped, just inches away, his breath heavy. For a moment, Jack thought the dog might pull away again, retreat into the shadows, but Rex didn't. Instead, the German shepherd lowered his head, and Jack held his breath, knowing this moment could slip away as easily as it had come. Then something shifted. Rex's nose twitched, and he sniffed the air, his head lifting just enough to meet Jack's gaze. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a flicker of trust in those eyes. It wasn't the same as before, the unshakable bond they'd once had, but it was a beginning. A crack in the walls Rex had built around himself, a sign that the dog was remembering the man who had once been his world. Jack exhaled, a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He reached forward slowly, cautiously, not wanting to spook the dog again. His fingers brushed against Rex's fur, and the contact felt like the world had shifted back into place. Rex flinched at first, his body stiff, but then slowly, as if testing the waters, he relaxed. A soft, almost imperceptible sigh escaped from him. The tension that had coiled in Jack's chest for weeks seemed to ease, replaced by something else. Something fragile, but real. "You remember me, don't you?" Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me, Jack, your partner. We've been through hell and back together, you and me." Rex's tail, which had been tucked tight against his body, gave the faintest of twitches. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the veteran and the war dog stood together, not as man and animal, but as two beings who had endured the same battle, faced the same pain, and now, slowly, cautiously, began to find their way back to each other. Jack knelt down, his voice a gentle murmur. "You're going to be okay, Rex. We're going to make it through this together." And for the first time since Rex had arrived at his doorstep, Jack felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The storm outside raged on, but inside, Jack and Rex stood on the precipice of something new, a fragile hope, a new beginning forged from the ashes of their shared past. The road ahead would still be difficult. There would be more setbacks, more struggles. But for now they were together, and that was enough. The weeks that followed the storm were a slow, steady climb toward healing. It wasn't a perfect road. There were still days when Rex withdrew into himself, when the glimmer of recognition in his eyes would flicker and then fade, leaving Jack to wonder if his partner had truly returned or if the past was just a shadow he could never outrun. But Jack never gave up. Each day, he worked with Rex. He was patient. He never pushed too hard. He respected the dog's boundaries, but he also held out hope. Hope that if he just kept showing up, just kept being there, Rex would eventually find his way back to him. There were moments of triumph, small victories, that made Jack's heart swell with pride. One afternoon, while they were playing in the backyard, Rex retrieved the ball and brought it back to Jack without hesitation. The joy in the dog's eyes as he dropped it at Jack's feet was a sign that the connection between them was starting to rebuild, one small step at a time. The progress was slow, but it was real. And with every breakthrough, every softening of Rex's defenses, Jack felt the weight of the past few months lift a little more. One morning, Jack woke to find Rex lying at the foot of his bed, his body stretched out on the rug. The dog's breathing was steady, relaxed, a stark contrast to the tense, nervous energy that had once defined him. Rex had begun to trust again, and in doing so, he had given Jack something he hadn't realized he needed so desperately: hope. It wasn't just the quiet mornings or the calm afternoons that had changed. There was something deeper, a shift in the way they interacted. Jack no longer had to coax Rex to trust him, to come to him. Slowly, Rex started seeking him out, sitting by his side, following him from room to room, the way he used to when they were partners on missions. It was as if the old Rex was beginning to emerge from the shadows of his trauma, piece by piece. But Jack knew it wasn't enough to just be patient and wait for Rex to come around. He needed to give the dog something to help him move forward, something that would remind Rex of their bond, something that would show him the loyalty and love they had shared. One evening, after the sun had set and the house was quiet, Jack took out the old military whistle. The same whistle he'd used to call Rex back to his side during missions, the whistle that had been a lifeline for both of them in the chaos of war. Jack held it in his hands for a long moment, remembering the times it had echoed across the battlefield, a call that had brought Rex running to him no matter the danger. "Maybe it's time," Jack whispered to himself. With his steady hand, he brought the whistle to his lips and blew two sharp, familiar notes. The sound cut through the silence of the room, filling the space between them. For a moment, Jack felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what Rex would do. He didn't know if the dog even remembered the sound. But he had to try, for both of them. Rex's head shot up at the sound, his ears pricking forward, his body stiffening. For a moment, Jack thought the dog might run, might turn away. But instead, Rex's eyes locked onto him, and for the first time in months, there was something in those eyes that Jack hadn't seen before. It was the spark of recognition, of trust, of knowing that this was a call that only he, Rex, could answer. Jack held his breath, his heart pounding as the seconds ticked by. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Rex sprang to his feet and bounded toward Jack. The veteran's heart soared as the dog reached him, stopping just in front of him, his tail wagging for the first time in what felt like forever. "You came back," Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Rex sniffed at Jack's hands, his body trembling with excitement and uncertainty, as if trying to understand why this moment felt so familiar, yet so new. Jack didn't reach for him right away. He knew better than to force anything. Instead, he simply knelt down, looking at Rex with all the love and care he had for his partner. He was here and Rex was here, and that was enough. For the next few days, Jack continued to work with Rex, repeating the same process, slowly but surely breaking through the barriers the dog had built around himself. And with each passing day, the bond between them grew stronger. It wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't the same as before, but it was real. One morning, as Jack and Rex sat together on the porch, watching the sun rise over the horizon, Jack knew that their story wasn't over yet. They had both been through hell, had both suffered in ways others would never understand. But they had made it out the other side, together. And no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. Jack smiled, reaching down to gently pat Rex's head. "You're a good boy," he said softly. "The best partner I could ever ask for." Rex looked up at him, his eyes calm and steady, and Jack knew that this time, the trust between them wasn't just a fragile flicker. It was a bond that had been reforged in the fires of hardship and pain. And no matter what the future held, Jack would always be there for Rex, just as he had been all those years ago. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like everything was going to be okay. The days following Rex's breakthrough were filled with quiet, healing moments. Jack had always known that recovery wouldn't be immediate, that there would be setbacks, but the feeling of Rex's trust returning, however fragile, was enough to make him feel like every minute had been worth it. In the weeks that passed, their routine became more familiar. The early mornings, when Jack would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the sun rise slowly over the yard, felt different now. Rex had started sitting by his side, his warm presence a comforting reminder that the bond they shared was not beyond repair. The tension that had once been a constant in Rex's body had lessened. His posture had softened, the stiffness fading as he began to move with more confidence, his tail wagging at the simple pleasure of being near Jack. But it wasn't just the dog who had changed. Jack found himself softer, more patient, his heart less burdened by the ghosts of his own past. The journey had been just as much for him as it had been for Rex. He had learned the power of stillness, of waiting. In the quiet moments of simply being there, he had rediscovered something within himself, a strength that didn't come from fighting or commanding, but from simply showing up and being consistent. On a cool, breezy afternoon, Jack decided to take Rex out to the park again. He hadn't planned on it being a significant trip, but as they arrived at the familiar field, something felt different in the air. Rex's eyes gleamed with an almost playful energy, a far cry from the withdrawn animal that had arrived on Jack's doorstep months ago. He took a few steps toward the open space, looking back at Jack, waiting for the familiar signal, the flick of the wrist, the ball thrown into the air. Without hesitation, Jack threw it, and for the first time in a long while, Rex bolted after it with the speed and excitement Jack remembered. It was as if the years of training, the countless missions they had been through together, were suddenly alive in Rex once more. The dog ran in perfect form, retrieving the ball and bringing it back to Jack with that same glint of pride in his eyes. Jack crouched down, meeting Rex at eye level. He could hardly contain his smile, the emotion welling up in his chest. "That's it, boy. That's what I remember." Rex nuzzled his hand with a soft whine, as if to say, "I'm here, I'm back." It was more than just a game. It was a moment of reconnection, a reaffirmation that the two of them were no longer just surviving, but truly living again. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the park, Jack sat on a bench with Rex at his feet. The world around them was calm, the noise of the day fading into the evening. It was a moment that felt timeless, as if everything had come full circle. "Whatever happens next, we're in this together," Jack said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Rex, lying contentedly at his side, gave a soft, satisfied sigh. There were no more barriers between them, no more distance. They had both suffered, both endured in silence. But now, as the twilight settled around them, they understood something that had once been impossible to see. Healing was not about forgetting the past. It was about rebuilding something new, stronger than before. As they stood to leave the park, Rex trotting ahead with a renewed energy, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not just for the dog who had saved his life in ways he couldn't describe, but for the quiet resilience they had found in one another. The path had been long, filled with uncertainty and pain, but it had led them to this moment of peace. There would still be hard days, still be moments when doubt crept in. But they were no longer just a veteran and a war dog. They were two souls who had walked through darkness together and come out into the light, side by side. As Jack drove home that night, Rex's head resting on the seat beside him, he realized the journey was far from over. There would be new battles ahead, but this time, he and Rex would face them together. The bond they had forged in the heat of war had survived the fires of trauma, and it would continue to hold strong as they moved forward, two partners unbreakable. And that, Jack knew, was the true meaning of loyalty.